She was dragged from her chariot in broad daylight, in the middle of the city, in front of witnesses. A mob had been waiting for her. They pulled her into a church, one of the grandest in Alexandria, stripped her of her clothes, and killed her with roof tiles and oyster shells. Then they burned her body so that nothing remained to be buried. Her name was Hypatia. She was the most celebrated intellectual in the late Roman world. She had advised emperors and governors. She had taught men who would become bishops. She had run the greatest philosophical school in the Mediterranean for 30 years. And in March of 415 AD, the most powerful Christian bishop in the world decided she was a problem that needed solving. What happened to Hypatia was not a random act of mob violence. It was a political execution, dressed up in religious fervor, carried out in daylight because the man who ordered it knew no one would stop him. He was right. Alexandria, in the early 5th century AD, was the kind of city that made everything else feel provincial. It had been the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean for 700 years. The great library, or what remained of it after decades of fires and political upheaval, was still the symbol of an entire civilization's relationship with knowledge. The city sat at the junction of Africa, the Middle East, and the sea routes to Rome, which meant it was simultaneously one of the wealthiest and one of the most volatile places in the empire. Pagan, Jewish, and Christian communities crowded against each other in its narrow streets, and the friction between them was constant, sometimes explosive, never fully resolved. Into this world, sometime around 360 AD, Hypatia was born. Her father was Theon of Alexandria, one of the leading mathematicians and astronomers of the age. He had devoted his career to preserving and annotating the great Greek mathematical texts, Euclid's Elements, Ptolemy's Almagest, and he raised his daughter as his intellectual heir. This was unusual. It was not unheard of. The philosophical tradition that Alexandria had inherited from Athens included women as students and teachers, and Theon seems to have believed, with genuine conviction, that his daughter was the more gifted mind. He was probably right. By the time Hypatia reached adulthood, she had surpassed him. She became head of the Neoplatonist school in Alexandria, a philosophical tradition that stretched back to Plato, but had evolved over centuries into a rich, complex synthesis of mathematics, metaphysics, astronomy, and ethics. She lectured publicly. She taught students who came from across the empire, many of them wealthy young men from Christian families, sent to Alexandria precisely because her school was the finest available. She corresponded with scholars in Athens, Constantinople, and Rome. Her students worshipped her, not metaphorically, but in the exalted, devoted way that intellectual mentorship can produce in people who have never encountered a mind quite like that one. She never married. Accounts describe suitors being turned away. One story, possibly apocryphal but telling, describes her responding to an unwanted admirer's persistence by throwing a menstrual cloth at him and saying with surgical precision, "This is what you claim to love. This is not beauty. This is flesh." She was not interested in performance. She was interested in ideas. For decades, that was enough to protect her. By the early 5th century, Alexandria was a city with two competing power centers, and they were at war. The Roman governor, the prefect, was a man named Orestes. He was the official representative of imperial authority, responsible for taxation, order, and the administration of one of the empire's most strategically critical cities. He was Christian, a baptized member of the church, but he was also a pragmatist, and he understood that governing a city as diverse as Alexandria required the kind of careful, secular balance that religious absolutism made impossible. The Bishop of Alexandria was a man named Cyril. Cyril had a different understanding of power. He had inherited from his uncle and predecessor Theophilus a tradition of aggressive, expansionist church authority, a model in which the bishop was not merely the spiritual head of Christian Alexandria, but the dominant political force in the city as a whole. He had expelled the Jewish community from Alexandria in a violent purge shortly after taking office, seizing their property and turning the population of a district that had existed for centuries into refugees. He commanded a private militia, the Parabolani, nominally a group of lay monks charged with caring for the sick, in practice a street-level enforcement arm that did the bishop's political work with fists and blades. Orestes despised him. Cyril despised Orestes. Their conflict was open, bitter, and increasingly dangerous. Hypatia was Orestes' closest advisor. She had no official position. She held no formal government role. But she was the person the prefect trusted, the woman whose intellectual clarity and political judgment he sought when navigating the city's impossible factionalism. Her letters survive, or fragments do, and they show a mind that understood power precisely, how it was accumulated, how it was lost, how it could be used without being consumed by it. Cyril understood what this meant. Hypatia was not just a philosopher. She was the philosophical legitimacy behind the secular authority that was blocking his consolidation of power. She was the reason Orestes was coherent. Remove her, and the governor became isolated, easier to outmaneuver. And she was not Christian. She was not aggressively pagan either. By the 5th century, open paganism was illegal, and Hypatia was far too intelligent to court that particular persecution. She was a Neoplatonist who taught her students to see the divine in mathematical harmony and cosmic structure. Her philosophy was not anti-Christian. Some of her most devoted students became priests and bishops. But it was not Christian either. It was its own thing, ancient, independent, pre-imperial, and therefore suspect. Cyril began whispering that she was a witch, that she practiced sorcery, that she had enchanted the governor and bound him to her will, preventing any reconciliation between the imperial prefecture and the Holy Church. It was a clever lie. Not because anyone fully believed it, but because it gave the mob a frame. Sorcery was a crime. Sorcery committed against a Christian governor by a pagan woman was a particularly satisfying crime to imagine. The mob he commanded didn't need much more than that. In the world of late Roman politics, reputation was infrastructure. It was what held alliances together, what made legal proceedings possible, what determined whether a governor could keep order or whether the street would decide. Cyril dismantled Hypatia's reputation with the patient efficiency of someone who had done this before. He had done this before. The campaign against the Jewish community had used similar mechanics. A specific accusation, repeated until it felt like common knowledge, amplified through networks of monks and clerics and street-level partisans, until the thing being said became the thing being known, regardless of whether it was true. Cyril understood, with a sophistication that would be recognizable to any modern political operative, that you don't need to prove a charge. You only need to make it sticky. Hypatia was accused of preventing peace. She was named, in the church's unofficial communications, as the source of the conflict between the bishop and the prefect, not as an advisor or a colleague, but as an agent of division, a saboteur, a woman who was deliberately using her influence to corrupt a Christian governor and keep him from submitting to appropriate spiritual authority. The Parabolani heard this. The monks in the desert communities around Alexandria heard it. The crowds who gathered at Cyril's sermons heard it. Not from Cyril directly, he was careful, but through the layered whisper network that a well-organized religious institution could operate with plausible deniability. Meanwhile, Hypatia continued to teach. She continued to advise Orestes. She wrote letters. She gave lectures. She did not, apparently, believe she was in mortal danger. Why would she? She had spent her life in Alexandria. She had taught the sons of powerful men. She had never been threatened before. She may have underestimated how thoroughly the ground had shifted. The man who actually led the mob was named Peter. He was a reader in the church, a minor official, a functionary. His role in what followed suggests either that he was acting on Cyril's direct instructions, or that Cyril had created a climate so charged with hatred that minor functionaries felt empowered to act and knew they would be protected. It was probably both. It was Lent. The city was already tense. The austerities of the season had a way of concentrating fervor into something volatile. The Parabolani had been gathering, not conspicuously, but gathering nonetheless. Hypatia was returning home from a visit, traveling in her usual way, in the open carriage that everyone in Alexandria knew. The city knew her face. She was not a recluse. She was one of the most publicly visible intellectuals in a city that understood public intellectuals. The mob stopped her carriage on the street. They dragged her out. The accounts vary in some details. The ancient sources are Socrates Scholasticus and John of Nikiu, writing from very different perspectives, and they disagree about what exactly was used to kill her. Roof tiles, oyster shells, pottery shards. The specifics hardly matter. What they agree on is that she was taken to the Caesareum, a great public building that had once been a pagan temple and was now a church, stripped naked and murdered in a sustained, deliberate way. Her skin was scraped from her flesh. She was killed slowly. Then her body, or what remained of it, was taken to a place called Cinaron and burned. The fire was not symbolic. It was forensic. Burning eliminated the remains, eliminated the grave, eliminated the possibility of martyrdom or memorial. Peter led the mob. Cyril did not appear. He was elsewhere. He was always elsewhere. Orestes reported the murder to Constantinople. He named Cyril as responsible. He demanded accountability. Nothing happened. Constantinople was embroiled in its own dynastic struggles, and Alexandria was far away, and Cyril was politically connected in ways that Orestes was not. The church held its own investigation, which is to say, Cyril investigated Cyril, and concluded that the mob had acted without instigation, driven by righteous anger at a sorceress who had corrupted a Roman official. Orestes was recalled to Constantinople shortly after. He disappears from the historical record. Whether he resigned, was reassigned, or suffered some worse fate is unknown. Cyril was made a saint. He remains a doctor of the church to this day. The Neoplatonist school in Alexandria did not immediately collapse after Hypatia's death. It continued for another century, growing quieter and more cautious, retreating into privacy, no longer conducting the open public lectures that had been Hypatia's signature. The next generation of Alexandrian philosophers taught behind closed doors to vetted students, with an awareness of risk that the previous generation had not had to carry. By the late 6th century, the school was gone. The tradition did not vanish entirely. It migrated to Athens, briefly, until Justinian shut down the pagan philosophical schools in 529 AD. Then to Persia, where the scholars found refuge at the court of Khosrow first. Eventually, centuries later, it would feed back into European intellectual life through the Arabic translation movement, the great project of preservation that kept Greek mathematics and philosophy alive long enough to become the foundation of the Renaissance. But the direct line, the school that Theon built and Hypatia made the finest in the world, that was finished. The philosophical capital of the Mediterranean closed in March of 415 AD in a church with roof tiles and fire. What is remarkable in retrospect is how clearly the sources reveal the political calculation. Hypatia was not murdered because she was dangerous in herself. She was murdered because she was useful to someone who was competing with someone else. She was a resource being denied to an enemy. The fact that she was also a human being, one of the most gifted of her age, was incidental to the calculation. Cyril went on to become one of the most influential theologians in Christian history. His writings on the nature of Christ shaped the Council of Ephesus in 431 AD. His legacy is immense, contested, and still very much alive in the theology of multiple Christian traditions. Hypatia became a ghost story. Her name was kept alive not by institutional memory but by fragments, letters from students, passing references in chronicles, a few chapters in Socrates' Scholasticus. The full catalog of her mathematical and astronomical work was lost. We know she wrote commentaries on Diophantus and Apollonius and helped her father with his edition of Ptolemy, because her students mentioned it. The texts themselves are gone. In the 19th century, a novel was written about her. In the early 20th, a film. In 2009, Alejandro Amenabar made a film called Agora that brought her story to a new audience. Each retelling shapes her slightly differently. Martyr, feminist icon, symbol of reason against superstition. None of those framings are quite right, and all of them are pointing at something true. She was a woman who occupied a position of enormous intellectual authority in a world that was deciding, politically and violently, what kinds of authority it was willing to allow. She was on the wrong side of that decision, and the man who made the decision is buried in history as a saint. Cyril of Alexandria is canonized. Hypatia of Alexandria is a ghost. Think about what it takes to build a reputation across 30 years of public teaching, to be trusted by governors and corresponded with by scholars across 3 continents, to have your students describe you with a devotion that is almost religious, and then to be erased so completely that we can't even reconstruct your own writing. Think about who decided what got preserved, who wrote the chronicles, who funded the monasteries that copied the manuscripts, how many Hypatias are still missing.